President Kamala Harris has been holding a series of meetings focused on voting rights. She's leading White House efforts on the issue as Democrats are sounding the alarm. Several state legislatures have recently passed measures that activists say will make it harder for people to vote, but supporters argue the legislation is necessary to prevent fraud. CBS News White House reporter Tim Perry spoke by phone with the vice president about election legislation earlier this week, and he's with us now. So, Tim, President Biden has called on Congress to pass federal voting legislation. What did you learn from the vice president about what she's doing behind the scenes, working with lawmakers to get that legislation passed?
That's right. And, one of the big things that the vice president told me during our conversation is that she's actually speaking to Republicans. And that is a very, very, very essential thing for the vice president to do, because if you want any legislation passed, especially with the 50-50 split vote in the Senate, she has to be speaking to Republicans. And so the vice president told me that she's not only speaking to Republican senators, but Republicans all throughout the country to try to garner some support for any meaningful voting legislation going forward. The only problem is when I pressed the vice president on who exactly she's speaking to, she mentioned Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican, and her office and Murkowski's office both had to issue a clarification telling me that, in fact, they did not speak about voting legislation or voting rights, but they're actually speaking about infrastructure, and that raised some eyebrows throughout the city in D.C.
Yeah, that caused a little bit of a kerfuffle there. You also spoke to the vice president about the debate over the filibuster, because certainly many progressives feel that nothing will get done unless the filibuster is abolished or at least altered in some way. What did she tell you about her position on that issue?
Well, her position is essentially the administration's position, and that is they are leaving it to the Senate Democrats to figure this out. They're not putting any of their marbles in getting rid of the filibuster as we speak right now. And that angers a lot of the activists, a lot of the voting rights leaders that I speak with, because we all know that it's probably virtually impossible for for the Democrats to get 10 Senate Republicans to vote for any meaningful legislation. And Democrats will not be able to get to that 60 vote threshold. And, it's just not going to happen as it stands right now. And also, to make matters worse for Democrats, Senator Joe Manchin, Senator Kristen Sinema have both said that they probably will not support any type of filibuster reform, even if it's a carve-out to get voting legislation through. So Democrats have their backs against the wall on this particular issue.
So the vice president met with poll workers yesterday. I want to play a little bit of the sound, what she said.
We saw that poll workers, it talked about leading up to the 2020 election, the most recent big national election, began to receive threats, forcing some to have to work around the clock, getting protection, around-the-clock protection. And many of these threats came from folks who were, as we turned out, unhappy with the outcome of the election.
All right, so what other groups has the vice president been meeting with, and what has her focus been when it comes to these meetings?
Right. So part of the vice president's job when she's leading voting rights efforts is building coalitions. And she speaks about that pretty often. She spoke to me about that, the importance of getting people on the ground involved and helping them to move the public opinion on some of this voting legislation. And so just last week, she met with some of those Texas legislators who left Texas to break quorum for any legislation there. She met with some of the black women leaders who were arrested on Capitol Hill last week, to advance voting rights. And she told me exclusively, actually, that next week she plans to meet with some Native American and some Alaskan leaders to discuss voting rights. And when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Super Bowl champions, came to visit the White House, she actually met with a couple of those players to talk about get out the vote efforts. And so she sees this as a way to just bring a big coalition of people in this country together around this issue that the administration says is extremely important.
The other thing that she has on her plate is immigration and figuring out ways to stem the flow of undocumented immigrants coming across the border, the U.S.-Mexico border. She's going to be holding a meeting today, I believe. You know more about her schedule. Can you tell us what the focus of that meeting is going to be?
The focus of that meeting is on DACA recipients, and that is important because just last week, at the end of last week, a Texas federal judge declared that DACA is unlawful, and DACA is the Obama-era program. And this judge said that it was unlawful, and is blocking the Biden administration from processing any new applicants into that program. And the Biden Department of Justice, they have said that they would appeal that decision. But as it stands right now, these recipients, these applicants cannot get through. And so the vice president, a White House official, tells me she is planning on meeting with 11 recipients and some immigration reform leaders to bring attention to that issue and to urge Congress to act swiftly on immigration reform, on creating a pathway to citizenship for these DACA recipients before time runs out.
All right. Tim, so glad you joined us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.